beginning a series of 2024 interviews planned for the purpose of better informing the American public about what is actually happening to the power of their vote. In almost all of mainstream media's publications about what happened during the 2020 election, the same phrase was unanimously repeated. There is no evidence of widespread election fraud. In many publications, it is dogmatically repeated in every single election fraud article published. It begs an obvious question that you're not supposed to ask. How could any of these publications actually know for sure that there is no widespread election fraud? Both political parties have questioned election results historically. What exactly changed in 2020 when speculation about election integrity newly became not just taboo, but also grounds for weaponizing the legal system against the curious? For all who are new to the administration of 21st century elections, the process has become much more involved than counting stacks of paper ballots. Paper ballots are still filled out, but they're processed by a machine. We newly take the leap of faith in assuming that our vote is secure and the tally is correct. Behind the scenes, the actual election process is much more complex than a counting machine counting ballots. Post-doctorate level complex in its totality. A level of complexity that is outside of the awareness of the common voter. A level of complexity that makes a perfectly ideal environment for nefarious manipulators. Despite having already been years, it's time for the general public, which has been cast into a state of confusion regarding election integrity, to sort out what happened during the 2020 elections. My goal today with this interview is to flesh out the key vulnerabilities that lead to modern election fraud, which existed in the 2020 election and will almost certainly still exist walking into the 2024 election. That is, unless public awareness quickly multiplies and massive movements mobilize soon to renovate the integrity of the American vote. My guest today is a former prosecutor, an award winning former business law professor who left teaching by protesting New Mexico State University's COVID restrictions. He has since decided to battle the nefarious manipulators of the system by researching what's happening and then teaching the general public all over the country how their primary tool for effecting change in government is being squandered. Having observed with discipline the state of election integrity, documenting it for everyone for free weekdays at 12:30 p.m. Eastern at the end of every theveryright.com newspaper, I can say with confidence that David Clements has demonstrated top leadership in explaining how our election system has been subverted. The Very Right News first covered David on April 1st, 2021. David has since repeatedly been caught by the Very Right, both providing new substance and demonstrating leadership by managing to foist himself into the fray over a dozen times since. Today, I'm humbled to welcome my guest, David Clements, and hope he will outline through Q&A the state of election integrity in the United States. Hello, David.
Hey, Jeff, it's good to be with you.
So let's go ahead and start. The IRS recently came after you for $19,368 from tax year 2021, essentially immediately after publishing your documentary, Let My People Go, which is primarily about election integrity, in January 6, 2021. Will you please provide some details about your recent experience with the IRS?
Well, we can start that it hasn't been good. Part of my duties as a law professor was we had a master's level program for accountants and people that wanted to get their MBA. They had to go through my course. In particular, I had to teach them the Uniform Commercial Code. And so what you need to know is that your CPAs are typically tasked with keeping people in compliance with the IRS when they do their bookkeeping. And so I was someone who actually was responsible for teaching CPAs how to do things above reproach. And in 30 years of paying taxes, I've never been audited until I launched Let My People Go.
It was days
The
after, right?
It was just 3 days after, so just right before um, Christmas, we got a bill, and right now the interest is accruing, so it's over $20,000 and counting, because even when you appeal it, you're penalized, and you're basically dealing with a nameless, faceless agency that in the amorphous framework that's provided by the IRS, there's no real clear guidelines on how to treat certain forms of income. And so they sent me a bill related to a 2021 tax return. And the thing that was curious about it is that it centered on contributions that uh, were sent to me through a fundraiser at Give Send Go. And after I was suspended, there was a lot of goodwill. A lot of people had been following me at that time, and we raised, close to $280,000 in the span of a week. And ultimately, I pledged that we would use that money to bring awareness to the J6ers and perform audits and canvasses. But it was charitable. There were no strings attached. In fact, I didn't even set it up. It was set up by Joe Altman, who's a dear friend and patriot. And so many people are saying, "Hey, just take care of your family. Get a new car." And we didn't do any of those things. But the problem that we anticipated was that Give Send Go issues a 1099 even for charitable contributions. So even though all of that money should have been tax exempt, um, we knew that there was going to be a presumption that it was income based on just knowing that the IRS loves to get their hands on people's money. And so instead of worrying about it and trying to go through just excruciating bookkeeping, knowing that I'm not an ally or friend of the Biden regime, we paid full income tax on stuff that was actually tax exempt to avoid the very issue that we faced ourselves with in this past December. And even though we paid a check to the IRS for $87,000, I've never had to write a check that big in my entire life. Even though I know that much of that money is going to a weaponized IRS that is now, I think, uh, staffed, I think, nearly 87,000 IRS agents. I just thought of that right now, that are armed and can go after political opponents of the Bidens. Um, that was
And
my
counting.
encounter. That was my encounter this past December.
Okay. Let's move on to the next question then. One of the most typical things you'll hear or read on the topic of 2020 election fraud is that challenges in the court went nowhere. Thus, there is no evidence of widespread fraud. Is that accurate? And who has legal standing to question American election integrity?
Well, it's not accurate in the standpoint that we need a case of first impression to deal with standing in the context of elections. Typically, what happens is a court will not even take a case and hear the merits of whatever's filed if there's a political remedy. Meaning, if you can vote, certain people out of office because you think a bill or a legal provision is unpopular, typically courts won't even take your case. And that was something that we
It
saw.
entirely relies on the system to actually work.
It does, but time and time again, one of the more popular examples was Obamacare. Many business owners were sitting there going, "Do I have to reduce my employment force to less than 40, less than 100?" Many of them filed lawsuits, and the refrain from many courts was, "You don't have standing, because if you don't like the law, regardless of the constitutional analysis and blunders presented by Justice Roberts, they were able to maintain that you have a remedy, which is, if you don't like the law, vote the bums out of office." So applying that framework to the question of elections, you can already see the fatal problem, which is, how do I vote bums out of office if the very issue is the architecture of whether or not our votes are being meaningfully counted? And so until a case is taken up by the Supreme Court, you've got a problem, because whether people like this or not, I know there's many common law proponents out there about how to read the law, but the fact of the matter is, most judges have been brought up and selected under a different judicial framework or different judicial philosophy. It's not originalism. I'm an originalist. I think Clarence Thomas is an originalist, Scalia was an originalist, but most of the justices and most of the federal judges um, follow a philosophy known as legal positivism. And basically, whoever makes the law, is right. And
Mhm.
so, with that framework, it creates certain problems for district courts and lower courts of appeal, because there's no case that has been raised that really resolves the issue of an appropriate understanding of standing in this context. So the byproduct of that is that out of 90 lawsuits that were filed by Trump, the RNC, the GOP, most weren't taken up and placed on the merits. And that was something that the 65 Project was bragging about repeatedly. The reality is, out of those 90 cases, 30 were set for merits hearings, and 22 of the 30 cases, Trump, GOP, the RNC prevailed. The numbers have actually improved since then. There's actually two more cases that were taken up, with two more victories for Trump, the RNC, GOP. So that's a myth, number one. But regardless of certain cases being taken up, what I can tell you is that the ones that were taken up were not outcome determinative. So what I'm saying to you is that it looked like there's a level of fear of the judiciary to take on any case that would disturb the ultimate end result of Biden versus Trump or some of the larger races. They would rather just punt on those.
Who got voted for that? The Office of Fear.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, okay. You're one of the few who has done well to point out Obama's 2017 executive order, which declared American elections critical infrastructure. Will you please discuss the implications of one of Obama's last actions before leaving office?
Yeah. So as soon as um, Barack Obama declared that elections were part of the national critical infrastructure, FISMA compliance kicked in, and um, so people need to know that there are certain requirements that are required when you make that declaration. There's got to be an information system inventory. There's got to be risk categorization. There needs to be a system security plan. There has to be security controls. There has to be risk assessments. There's got to be certification and accreditation. And in the election sphere, to my knowledge, none of that has occurred. And so what you're seeing is a wholesale area where there's virtually no oversight. And when you're talking about, data that's being transferred, whether it's data with respect to voter rolls, vote tabulation, election night reporting, all of that would be covered under FISMA. And so what I'm telling you is they don't even have assessments. They haven't even done a robust analysis on the security metrics. So on the one hand, it seemed like there was this giant power grab to consolidate, um, you know, uh, kind of a one-stop centralized location where you can monitor election data real time. And whether or not Barack Obama understood the implications of that decision when he did that, FISMA kicked in, and there's a requirement to do a ton of testing, a ton of risk assessment, and none of that took place. And so we've been in an environment since 2017 where there's virtually nothing on the books that oversees this, these requirements under the law.
Yes. Okay. So, can election machines be corrupted? And if they can be, what does that say about the current state of election security and election integrity?
Yes, and you can see by way of the admissions of many of the people that have, are on the scene, whether it's ES&S or Dominion. You've got internal emails that were recently leaked where Eric Coomer has admitted that they're not following certifications, that their product is riddled with bugs. It leads to incorrect results. ES&S had similar mea culpas where they've had massive security breaches that have been seen in their machines. In fact, Rick Weibel As a gentleman out of South Dakota just performed a test using ESNS machines, showing how wide open they are. I think one of the reasons why source code has not been provided, even though every state is required to keep a copy of it in escrow, is that it will actually show you how wide open these systems are. The source code, to my knowledge, will not show you algorithms, but it'll show you how easy it is to basically access the databases and do whatever you want with them. And to date, even though all of the source code is held in escrow in theory across the country, uh, on not one single occasion have I seen that source code produced to independent auditors for review. In fact, even the auditors that work for Wiley Labs, ProVNV, SLI Compliance, these are the quote unquote approved testing agencies, will tell you, if you put them under oath, that they're not given the entire source code to look at. They're given a sliver of it. Well, any nation state expert would tell you that there's no way to examine whether your source code is faulty unless you have all of it. And that insight was provided by Clay Parikh, who's someone who had top security clearances and was a whistleblower for Wiley Labs.
And there are many different vulnerabilities with the machines to mention. We probably
Yeah,
can't
it
even
really
go
just
through them all
depends
right now.
on how much time you've got. I mean, look, you've got weak to no credentials that are required to access the systems. We've been told that they don't have chip modems. They do. At least the high-speed tabulators do. Now the new lie from the vendors is, yeah, we have them in there, but we turn them off, which is different than what they were saying for the better part of 3 years, which is no, there's no internet connection, there's no Wi-Fi capability. Well, they've been caught. ESNS had apologized back in 2014 when it was revealed that over 14,000 of their DS200 units had chip modems affixed to motherboards, and then we learned that that number is actually closer to 30,000, and many of those units are still in use across the United States. And so now we're just supposed to feel great that we can take the word that they turn off the modems. Problem with that is that we've got a nation state expert by the name of Jeffrey Lemberg who learned that you can access the systems, turn them on without the screen even turning on itself. So you can have clerks that are in a room and have their tabulators accessed and infiltrated, and there would be no signs for them to see that their computer had actually been hacked. So that's
Just like
another issue.
somebody remoting into a desktop, it's the same type of situation.
Yeah. And that was one of the subversions that we noted in Antrim County, Michigan, is that there was remote access by someone who had zero credentials and was able to manipulate the software in a way that shifted votes through a series of indices where, certain vote totals were dropped and Trump's vote totals were allocated to Joe Biden. And that was an expert finding that hasn't been disturbed some 3.5 years later.
Yes. Okay. Especially relative to the current state of Michigan's voter rolls, which you can talk about also. What is the significance of the finding of the fraudsters who got caught in October 2020 with way more than 10,000 mail in ballots, along with guns, silencers, prepaid cell phones, and prepaid credit cards in Muskegon, Michigan?
Well, there's a lot of things that are significant. Number one, in October of 2020, Jocelyn Benson, who's the Secretary of State, informed county clerks across the state that they could expect to see an influx of 700,000 people on the voter rolls, and which is pretty head scratching. Why that amount? Why then? And we know from an independent standpoint that was to create a credit line, and most of which is likely not even real voters. And so most states see this huge spike, especially in the decline to state independent registration base, where when you look around and you ask people, most people actually hold their nose and they pick one of the major parties. Independents, I think if we had a more accurate tally, probably be 7 to 8%. But in most states, you're finding it's a 31 to 35% registration base, which is this huge credit line. And one of the phenomena that we saw, at least through VR systems in Florida, were that people were inactive on rolls in other counties would be inserted into neighboring counties with a switch of some of their information, including their party affiliation, so that you can take these um, declined to state independent voters, switch their voter registration day of, mind you, as Democrats or Republicans, and then they would cast a vote. These aren't real people for the most part. And the reason why you don't want them to be real people is if you happen to show up to the polls and find out that you've already voted, that's going to create um, a giant spotlight. So, I mean, that's one of the manifestations, but that was Michigan. So you had this question about what's the significance of 10,000 paper ballots, fraudulent ballots being found. Once you have an inflation of the voter roll database in the cyber world, you need to have some physical manifestation that materializes to then feed the tabulators. And so Muskegon had at least 10,000 fraudulent ballots on hand. I'm sure if you go to Wayne County, you probably had tens of thousands of fraudulent ballots to basically create an outcome that was not legitimate. The other thing that's really important to keep in mind with Muskegon is that that's the home of District Attorney DJ Hilson. DJ Hilson, in light of all the things that you just read in your question, has done nothing to investigate voter fraud. He made no arrests, and he was handpicked to go after investigators, namely attorneys Stephanie Lambert and Matt DePerno, and going after their cyber experts that found out that the machines in Michigan were subverted. And the latest breaking news out of Michigan was Stephanie Lambert, one of those attorneys, was arrested in a Washington D.C. courtroom from a bench warrant that was issued for her arrest related to DJ Hilson's office. Again, DJ Hilson being from Muskegon. When she returned to Michigan, not only was she fingerprinted and treated like a garden variety thug, and she was strip searched by male personnel. So there's just a massive persecution of those that are investigating, getting to the bottom of the fraud. And you're seeing this wholesale weaponization of district attorneys, the Attorney General, Dana Nessel, and unfortunately, many sheriffs are doing nothing.
Yeah, I agree. Oh, what is the Democrat Party's Act Blue? And could it be nefariously tied to deliberately bloated voter rolls?
Yes. What I can tell you is that Act Blue seems to be one of the fundraising arms of the Democratic Party. Republicans have their version, which is, I think, Win Red. And what we're finding with both Win Red and Act Blue is that there seems to be an unnatural, or dare I say, impossible way on how the funds are being divvied up and allocated across the country. And that's something that's showcased in the documentary Let My People Go, is that most states have use of a integrated software that also deals with campaign finance reporting. And so it's, think about a dashboard that allows you to track real-time data with respect to voter registration, the ability to inflate those rolls, deflate them, overwrite tabulated results. Well, it also has a database that keeps track of donations. And when we had experts taking a look at contributions being made, we would see people that were making donations to 800 races across the country. You and I both know that that wouldn't happen. Yet we were seeing that all the time. And one of the major candidates for the funneling of money was Act Blue. And so we were seeing things that were put out through James O'Keefe, where he's going door to door, of 31,000 individual contributions, most of which were under $10 a piece, totaling hundreds of thousands of dollars, but all coming back to one person and one address. And so to think of how impossible it would be for someone to actually take the time to make 4,000 contributions in one day for $21,000, it makes absolutely no sense. But when you start looking at the data, it shows basically an algorithm at work where you're finding, what we call Smurfs, which are unwitting facilitators of money laundering. So my voter identification or someone else's voter identification is basically hijacked, and someone is depositing money in that person's name, and we're seeing that in every single state. And it's just a systematic cheat. So yeah, it's not only a real problem. It seems to be integrated into the software that we see that touches on every other aspect of elections.
Yeah, when you combine the state of the economy, which is the government printing money that's not backed anymore by gold, if you combine that with accounts that are out there waiting to be filled with the fake money, and all you need to do in order to avoid a campaign campaign finance situation. There?
I'm here. I
Okay,
lost you
good.
for a second. Yeah.
Yeah, we can edit that out, thankfully.
Yeah.
I'm going to start back up with my point here, and I'll just edit all that out. Yeah, I lost internet connection. I didn't see you, and I thought, oh crap, what happens now? So I hit refresh. I think we're good. Anyway, yeah, if you can take Act Blue, which is an organization that finds people who are willing to donate, in this instance, to Democrats, although you didn't mention Win Red already, which is a Republican organization that does the same. Although I haven't read as much about them, I've read quite a bit about Act Blue. If you can take this type of an organization and you can take the fake money that the government prints, well, in order to avoid a campaign finance violation, well, you need a legitimate donor. And once that channel is created, then you can just dump. And what has been found by James O'Keefe and others is you can just keep dumping without the awareness of the general public.
Yeah. And unfortunately,
Okay.
there's not any fraud alerts. They're doing this through prepaid, like cards that you'd go to Walmart, and there's just no security protocols. If there's any weird activity on my credit card, I get notifications right away. But for some reason, it's as if Act Blue has gotten a pass with the entire financial industry when it comes to this phenomenon. The fact that they didn't even investigate and do anything about it after those James O'Keefe videos went viral, uh, it speaks volumes to their own corruption.
It reminds me of the gun codes that the credit card companies have been trying to put on gun purchases lately. Maybe they're flagging it in the system that way.
Yeah.
Okay. What is FirstNet?
FirstNet is basically the emergency response network for AT&T. Every single major telecom provider has the functional equivalent of FirstNet, and its origins really start with the idea that you know you only have so much bandwidth, and when calls are being taken up for service, you don't want to drop the most important calls, namely ones that are life and death situations. When Barack Obama declared elections to be part of that national critical infrastructure, it elevated the importance of elections on the same level as a 911 response call. The problem was you didn't have enough locations set up independent of AT&T's 5G network. All right, so the idea that you could somehow monitor election data real time in the early stages was impossible until AT&T's FirstNet basically volunteered one of their bands to make sure that election data monitoring was treated in that same tier. And so what happened was basically the FirstNet network is essentially the entire country. You can basically Google a picture of the FirstNet network. It's the 5G network. And what that allows is cellular access to potentially manipulate poll books that are connected to that network. We're finding that FirstNet was connected to many of the Cradle Point modems in Dallas County, Texas. We found them in Los Angeles County. We found them in Florida. We found documentation for the entire state of New Jersey. We're finding it in Maricopa on the reservation where people bring in FirstNet, portable cell networks. And the advantage of this for bad actors is that this network basically allows you to monitor things behind precinct and county firewalls. And a lot of people keep getting duped into thinking that you can't access and monitor um, election data. Well, that depends on whether the vendors themselves are good people or not. And when you've got bad actors that are being given guidance by the Atlantic Council and funded by Democracy Fund, these are radical groups that hate MAGA, they hate America First candidates, they hate Trump. Well, they're not being blocked access. Basically, the firewall, there's a hole right through it, and they've got complete access to take a look around and monitor everything. So it's really a combination of FirstNet in the ability to access these networks from a cellular standpoint, uh, and when you join that with the Albert sensor phenomena, which I know you're going to ask me about, that's what gives you complete coverage to monitor all the software, all the metrics real time.
Yeah, please feel free to incorporate the other questions that you know I'm going to ask into these because I know they are interconnected. It's kind of hard to isolate them, but I do want to get a definition base for the general public.
Yeah. Well, so think of this way: with Albert sensors, you're looking at networks that are more or less fixed. You go into your office, you've got some things that have routers in the wall. You've got something that, even when you do your own podcast, uh, typically you've got higher performance when you've got cables running right into your routers. Uh, FirstNet is not that. FirstNet is dealing with cellular connections. There might be some connections to modems and whatnot, but it's not the same permanent network that you would expect to see in a district attorney's office, in fire EMS, a law office. Typically, you've got fixed networks, and so the Albert sensors are. It's really just a fancy word for computer, named after Albert Einstein, to kind of give it this veneer of yeah, don't worry about anything. We'll protect you from cyber attacks because we've got these Albert Einstein sensors to make sure that if anything happens, we can detect it and thwart it. Um, but when you look at the plain language of the agreements, they're being entered into either by county election administrators or secretaries of state with this entity known as the Center for Internet Security, CIS, which is a non-government organization that works in partnership with the Department of Homeland Security. They're unregulated, they have no oversight, and all of their policy guidance has been provided by far left radical globalist groups such as the Atlantic Council. Under the auspices of protecting you from cyber attacks, they can monitor all data. They have access to all the software being run. And so basically, they get to live behind that firewall and think of it like as a house. If the firewall is this robust gate, and you got locks and pit bulls, they've got the key to get right in there, open the door, and start looking around and rummage through whatever they want to rummage through. That's the unfettered access that Albert Sensors gives this group, CIS. Um, the question is, can they then, from that standpoint, monitor and overwrite the data? And the answer to that is yes, because again, all 50 states use a form of third-party vendor software that's all inclusive, that's hooked to the internet, and they've got the ability to make adjustments to everything from voter rolls to vote tabulation to election night reporting to absentee ballot tracking. And we are seeing evidences of manipulation and um, algorithmic activity everywhere.
Yeah. Um, so what are Albert sensors and how do they relate to the Center for Internet Security? Do you want to talk a little bit more on that or? You
Well, I
want to
think
go
I've
straight to
answered
Seidel
the
and Edison
Albertsons are
research?
computers. They're behind precinct
Okay.
firewalls. They're part of your permanent network. And then the relationship is they have been deployed through agreements through CIS, and that's the Center for Internet Security. The other
Which
thing
is
that
related to that
CIS does,
Obama executive order.
it necessarily triggers FISMA requirements. And then the other thing that you have to understand, and this was covered by and large by Mike Benz on his interview with Tucker Carlson, CIS is also responsible for the censorship regime that will flag any posts that are negative to early voting, any posts that are negative to mail-in ballots, any posts that are negative with respect to the machines. CIS was the one that was really working with federal authorities on uh, platforms like Jira to silence any uh, dissent from, uh, you know, speaking in anything but glowing terms over the election infrastructure. And the number of posts that were purged from Twitter alone were 22 million. If you look at
Wow.
Google and some of the other places, you're talking about hundreds of millions of posts. And that was the 7 months leading up to November 3rd, 2020. So CIS's control was not only related to censorship, but also to the infrastructure on all of the systems that were being used in our elections. A lot of people have this misunderstanding that they think that the poll book um, or the election management system are part and parcel to what we call voting technology. And in a common sense standpoint, they absolutely are part of the voting technology, but legally, they're not considered voting technology. The only thing that's considered voting technology are tabulators, what you run a ballot through. But what you're finding out is that most of the operations with respect to elections are run on things that don't have any regulations whatsoever. And in that gray area, in the area where there are no laws that really, um, or that have any adequate standards for performance, that's where CIS is basically setting up the equipment that we use in every state.
What are Seidel and Edison research?
Okay. So Seidel and Edison really deals with what you see um, after your vote has been tabulated. So I like to think of voting as an input output system. Your input would be you walking in, getting your ballot, submitting it into a tabulator. The tabulator uh, has data that you're going to retrieve and put up to the election management system. So you've got basically this route that your vote will go, and then there's two outputs on what you see at the end of election night. One of those outlets is Seidel, which effectively has a monopoly on election night reporting. What you see on most Secretary of State's websites comes directly from Seidel. Seidel is foreign owned and located in Spain. So there raises some red flags there as well. And then Seidel data, we have confirmed, is the same exact data that you see on election night reporting. And you see that through Edison reports. Edison basically takes that same data, but puts it on your television screen. So for the most part, Seidel feeds your websites, your Secretary of State websites, and then Edison takes that same data and puts it on the TV for your tracking on CNN, Fox News, etc.
And we've seen the numbers in certain races hop around in live time. That has
Yeah,
to do with
well,
Seidel.
it does. So everything really is rooted in the Seidel data. The manifestation of where you see it could extend to Edison reports. But where we could get election night reporting data, we are seeing uniformly impossibilities. And some were more egregious than others if you can actually map it out real time. There are videos that we put out with 3 counties in North Carolina, 3 counties, I think, in Georgia, and 3 counties in Pennsylvania that all show oscillation, deletions, the switching of positions between mail in ballots and in person voting, pausing. Um, And yeah, so it's shocking to see. The straw man argument for that is that people are saying, no, these are projections. There's third party people that are giving their data. They're modeling things off of exit polling, and you just have to know that that's garbage. Many of us have voted. They don't have
Why
people
do
camped
that?
out at every single voting center getting accurate polling metrics from people as they walk out the door. And so, in order to say that exit polling, and when they start feeding this data to Seidel and Edison, somehow gives the ability for someone to call a race at 7:30 or 8 o'clock is ridiculous. And the other thing that's problematic for that explanation is that when you understand how data is accumulated, um, usually what happens at the close of polls, the clerks will retrieve all of the USB data sticks from the tabulators and they will upload them all at once. So even the idea of interval reports where you get an update at this time and this time and this time does not mirror the reality of how we're being told information is being acquired, unless, once again, you've got internet connections where you're monitoring that data real time. And so they can't even keep their lies straight with respect to the infrastructure. And then the other thing that I'll say is that the election night reporting, outside of, you know, the straw man arguments that they're presenting, we know that in many states, Seidel is directly providing that data, meaning there are no third-party entities that are involved at all. They're basically delivering raw data, and if you're delivering raw data through interval reports, you should see nothing but votes either staying the same or being added to, because it's an additive process. That's not being manifested in the election night reports that we've seen. And then the other thing is all 50 states show impossible PID controls. And these are proportional integral derivative functions. These are closed feedback systems that you would typically see in automated processes, kind of like your air conditioned thermostat or cruise control on your car. And in all 50 states, as a matter of, if you're in Wyoming or Washington, D.C., we're seeing this uh, drive towards a set point. And you really see it if you know how to look at the data, and you look at the data through ratios between two candidates. And so when we look at the Trump to Biden ratio, we see that Trump looks like he's going to just crush it in places. And then all of a sudden you see this massive injection of votes that brings it back down to a set point that favors Biden. Well, in order to get to that set point, you've got to maintain a certain uh, a certain place, and that's why you're seeing front loading at the beginning of elections, because it's just less noticeable to have something settle into a believable margin of victory like 51-49. And in order to keep that flat line in place, we're seeing data sets coming in with ratios that are 50-50 over and over and over again, which is not natural at all. It's impossible. We saw
And
over
it's not
90
an,
match
I need
sets.
to clarify too for any skeptic out there, it's not in every race that this may be happening, but they
Well,
don't
wait,
need every
no, no.
single race.
Well, we're seeing that PID function in all 50 states. Let's just put it that way. So, people get caught up. It's not as
Hmm.
egregious in some places, but for the most part, uh, no, you are finding this PID control. There's no other way to describe data coming in where report after report after report is maintaining a flat line. That shouldn't happen, yet it's there in all 50 states. I think the reason why people are confused as to the size and scope of the subversion is that they look around where they live and they say, well, wait a minute, I live in Wyoming. Everyone's Republican, everyone's red. So whatever the cheat is, it's obviously
Yeah.
not affecting Wyoming. And where I've got to caution them is that this is about an integrated system that really gives you operational control start to finish. And it's not just in some states, it's actually in all 50 states. And where you've got to worry about it in places like Wyoming is not in the general election, it's in the primary. And so when you start looking for manipulation in the election night reporting, you don't see it as much in the general elections between Republicans and Democrats, because no one in Wyoming would believe that a Democrat legitimately won. Okay, you can't have everyone winning Democrat races. So this is really about
Plausible
setting up
deniability.
yes, and shaping perception of having places that aren't red anymore but purple, or priming us for some scenario in Texas where it's becoming more and more blue. And they use election night reporting and the manipulation through these PID controls to shape that perception. That's what we're saying.
Yeah, that bled into my second to last question here. Actually, I'm gonna go ahead and say it once more because most of it was actually just me gonna. I was just gonna explain what I had seen and then see if you had something to say on top of it. So, as you demonstrated in your now free documentary, "Let My People Go," an initial data point in a modern vote tally can be implemented before a preset algorithm alters voting statistics in real time in order to tweak election data as programmatically prescribed to a pre established acceptable range of outcomes. I've noticed that the pre established acceptable range of outcomes tends to line up with the plausible deniability pushed on the general public regarding how the election will likely go. A lot of that's derived from polling agencies. I will. I was actually almost got a math minor in college. I was only one class shy, but I'm not new to math. Okay. The mathematical behavior that you described in the documentary is the mathematical behavior that I saw in real time. And nobody in real time was putting it into words very well. But within days to weeks to months, there were election integrity journalists like you who were leading the pack. Would you like to add any additional thoughts regarding the numerical planning behind the nature of modern day American election theft?
Sure. I mean, you have to look at what helps bad actors perfect their scheme. The more information they have, the more that they can account for variables. That's why they love early voting. That's why they love delayed reporting, because there's ways to manipulate your elections in some jurisdictions where you don't even have an internet connection. As long as you have, say, an integrated software like SCORE, which is what Dominion uses in Colorado, in early voting, you've got an absentee ballot metric where people can see how many absentee ballots have been sent out and how many have been returned. In places like Colorado, you don't even have a choice. It's going to be sent to you. So the presumption is that you're going to participate in a mail-in ballot election. So through that modeling, when you start seeing how many Republicans fill out their mail-in ballots and send them back in the mail, and you see the same for Democrats, you can now uh, calculate the delta to start creating fake ballots out of thin air. And because there's really no way to do a sufficient chain of custody, um, election workers are capturing those mail-in ballots, many of which are fake. They run them through the machines, and that's one way of subverting it. And so that's all using the data points early on, and you don't even have to, beam in and hack that tabulator later. You can, and many do, but there are ways to run technically elections where there's no subversion through weak credentials. Instead, what people are getting are the actual reports of who's shown up and who's requested a ballot. So now you've got this entire pool. You know who hasn't shown up to vote, who hasn't sent it in, and those are perfect candidates to start creating your fake ballots, hand them off to ballot mules, and let them stuff your ballot boxes. So there's examples like that, um, where we're seeing manipulation. We saw that in Montrose County, Colorado. They swear up and down they've got no manipulation. Yet when you look at the mail-in ballots, we still saw this impossible arrangement of votes towards a predictive outcome where 90% of the ballots that are thrown in the drop boxes were for Biden. All right. So like that doesn't make sense. Why is there such a disparity in early voting for a 90-10 ratio as opposed to 60-40 Trump later in the day? One of the big lies that we are told is that Democrats favor early mail-in voting and Republicans don't. That's a myth that was created out of whole cloth leading up to the 2020 election. If you actually look at data in most states, Republicans utilize early voting and mail in ballot voting as much as Democrats. They didn't start getting hip to it till they saw massive subversion in 2020. In New Mexico, we've got 30 some percent are Republicans. We analyzed data going back 30 years. And there were years that Republicans preferred early voting, mail in voting more so than Democrats. So it's one of these things where no one challenges the political scientists and the stink news media on these claims. We just take it because it was reported by the news. Um, but to see a 30-point advantage to a political party preferring a certain form of voting, there's no historical data that supports that. It's starting to reflect um, that now because we're becoming more wiser and we know how to combat the subversion. And the best way to combat the subversion is to withhold critical information to those that would subvert the systems. So instead of embracing mail-in voting, hold on to that ballot, show up to the actual physical location, hand the ballot, instead of you know um, embracing this ballot chasing, bank the vote garbage that's going out from Scott Pressler and Ronna McDaniel. No,
Mm.
you shouldn't be telling or telegraphing anyone about voting metrics. And so as when we do that, that we actually overwhelm and cause bad actors to basically make a decision, go completely balls to the wall crazy where the fraud is so easy to spot. Or in some cases, you'll see people pulling out of races or calling the races for the right candidate. We saw that in Kerry Lake's primary election. There was a Pence endorsed candidate that ran against Kerry Lake. They didn't want Kerry Lake to make it to the general, but because everyone was voting on election day, um, it screwed up their plans. The counter response in the general election, the Kerry Lake race against Katie Hobbs, was, well, let's just pre-configure the tabulators to fail in Republican leaning precincts on election day and then shame voters and tell them, well, you shouldn't have come in and voted on election day. And they use that as an argument not to get rid of the machines, which are defective. They use it as an argument for us
To
to get
push more
kowtowed
ballots.
into early voting. And so we gotta fight against those narratives to ensure that we've got some chance of overwhelming the cheat.
You led right into my final question, actually. What can we do to foil the plot against the integrity of our vote? And your what you just said there was right on target with my sixth point that I wanted to mention here. Mess with their data.
Mhm.
A strategy I have heard no one discuss yet is no longer registering as a Republican and turning independent, only to vote for the most freedom oriented candidate on election day, disrupting their ability to form an initial data point, forcing the system to bare minimum cheat more obviously, which is kind of what you were just saying right there
Well, in
about
some
cheating
ways,
more obviously.
but even then, it's when I talk about the operational control that the Albert sensors and the integrated software provide. Even though I'm not a registered Republican, if they have a voter history file on me, which they do, they've got a voter history file on everyone. They're looking at who are 4 out of 4 voters, 3 out of 4 voters, people that have a likelihood of showing up. And those that are low propensity voters are usually the ones that, when they do get off their butts and vote in person, they're told, well, you already voted. And that was a huge phenomenon that we saw with Trump because many people that weren't voting at all got out to vote for Trump because they identified with him as this anti-establishment candidate. So what I'm saying is that the elegance of these systems are such that you can, on principle, not be a registered Republican. On principle, I'm not. I'm definitely going to vote for Donald Trump, but make no mistake, I'm not safer by virtue of me being independent. Um, but what we're seeing is that the data basically is creating that credit line through this massive influx just before the month before. Some of those are real voters because you have to maintain the con. They're likely going to use as a credit line people that are on the rolls but rarely ever vote. But what I'm saying is a huge swath of those voters probably aren't real. Or one working theory is that you've got this border evasion with tens of millions of illegals that are being assigned ID numbers, and that's
Mhm.
what's being used to populate the voter rolls.
That
I've
was in
heard
the
many
news today,
accounts.
actually.
Yeah,
I was just going to say that was in the news today. New York overturned a previous ruling to allow 800,000 illegals to vote. That's what they're doing.
yeah, and they make the laws in such a way that prohibits election workers from cleaning their voter rolls to get rid of folks that might not or should not be voting in certain elections. Different states have different laws on whether you can participate in a state election versus a federal election or a municipal election. Um, but yeah, it's the system's wide open, Jeff. Um, we have to really just to I guess answer your last question is we have to get to systems that are closed. That's when we had some semblance of trust in the processes instead of using electronic poll books that are open, networked, internet connected. Get back to the paper poll books, which closes them down, deprives bad actors the metrics. You basically put a blindfold on the mules. They don't know where to go, and they don't know to what degree to cheat. And so, even if you just
Mhm.
got rid of the poll books alone, you would have a massive advantage in putting blindfolds on your mules. And then you just follow that same process across the board with tabulation and election night reporting.
A couple other things I'd like to add. Um, Learn how it's being done is a huge part of this. This isn't happening because everyone has already been adequately informed and everyone is already an election and procedure genius. Most people have no idea what we're even talking about in this interview, which is the whole point of having the interview.
Yeah.
Clean the voter rolls per the laws that already exist, which includes prosecuting both the violators and the enablers of the violators who are presently holding public office. Ban and investigate any vote tallies that occur after election day or maybe in the morning the next day. We have to set some rules here. Can't have constant elections or multi week long elections. It's just too much. What happened?
They're still counting
Um,
votes in California. They're still counting votes in Adam Schiff's
from
race,
which election?
the primary that happened weeks ago, which tells me that
Yeah,
Schiff is
California's.
historically unpopular and they're just going to continue to slow walk and roll out fake ballots until they get the result that they want.
And it seems like they're opening up that formula in California because California is taking way longer than everybody else.
Yeah.
Are they setting a precedent with that?
Well, it's happening everywhere. I mean, it's not just California. California's not going there. They're there. And Arizona, it was 10 days before we got legitimate or got the illegitimate results in the Kerry Lake race. Some places like Florida are doing better on counting votes in one day, but it's a completely different con in Florida. You've got this massive psyop on perceptions of DeSantis being a great candidate, and because we looked at cast vote record summaries there, and they didn't use the machines to cheat there in his particular race, which tells me that they ran an honest election,
Hmm.
not because DeSantis has got his fingers on the scale and is holding Dominion accountable. It's because he will help preserve the status quo. Um, I guarantee you, if you have DeSantis in a race against someone like Trump, take a look at those cast vote records again and see if the machines weren't involved. People need to keep in mind that there are forces behind the machines that want certain outcomes, and they know when to have a straight election without the machines being used to manipulate because they've done their job in brainwashing people, thinking that people are patriots versus rhinos. I mean, there's so many different nuances to how you would go about cheating. But just know, if you're a friend and ally to the vendors, chances are you've got someone who's probably not someone that you want in charge of your state or your elections.
Not only may it be possible that there is widespread election fraud, but the amount of ways that you could cheat are also very widespread and underestimated in a general sense. And another one, ban internet connected voting machines. Why are we using these? We got to get rid of the internet connected voting machines. Just doesn't make sense to have them. Limit mail-in ballot availability. See, one, and you already hashed on this one. So Republicans, some of them are saying, "Oh, go out, harvest more ballots." You can't do that if they're just going to create fake ballots. There's no end to that. And that's everything that I wanted to say. Is there anything else that you would like to say about it?
No, Jeff, I just appreciate you bringing me on, and we'll just continue to try to get people with good, solid information so they can adjust accordingly over the next 8 months.
Yeah, hopefully they'll get their butts in gear and do something about this. Hopefully they'll spread your video. And I wanted to plug your website, theprofessorsrecord.com. And also, David Clements co hosts a show on Lindell TV, which is found on frankspeech.com. And y'all should check that out. Anything else that you would like to add?
No, just Let My People Go is available for free. If anyone here wants to upload it, you can get a copy from frankspeech.com for free, and feel free to populate any channel, whether it's YouTube, Rumble, and spread the film far and wide.
Something that you didn't know is that I've already created a documentation page for our interview, and it already has a link on there for everybody. So
Great.
they will have no problem finding that.
Well, thank you,
Thank you
Jeff,
very much for coming.
All right. Well,
it's been a pleasure.
You take care. And yeah, same here. God bless.
God bless.